Sa nakaraang video, natutunan natin kung paano nakaayos ang mga electrons sa loob ng atoms, ang basic unit ng lahat ng matter, be it living or non-living. Yes, we have learned that all matter is made up of atom. Pero hindi lang ng isang klase ng atom, kundi ng napakarami at iba't ibang mga atoms. Paano nagsasama-sama ang mga atoms na ito para makabuo ng matter na nakikita natin? Yan ang sasagutin natin sa video na ito. Hi, kamusta? This is your Eman, a public school science teacher. Kung bago ka pa lang sa channel na ito, make sure na mag-subscribe ka muna at pindutin ang notification bell para notified ka every time na mag-upload tayo ng ating bagong videos. Our video for this week is based on the 7th most essential learning competency or MELC in Science 9, which is recognize the different types of compounds, ionic or covalent, based on their properties such as melting point, hardness, polarity, and electrical and thermal conductivity. We will be able to achieve this goal by discussing these three sections. First, we will be defining what chemical bond is. Second, we will find out the different types of chemical bond and how each type is actually formed. And for the third part, we will find out the difference between ionic and covalent compounds based on a set of properties. For the last part, we'll be doing a quick practice exercise to find out if you were able to understand our discussion or our lesson for this week. So ready ka na ba? Tara, simulan na natin. It is actually rare in nature or in our environment to encounter individual atoms. So yung bang mga nag-iisa na mga atoms. Instead, anywhere from 2 or hundreds or even thousands of these atoms join together forming the compounds, mixtures, and matter in general that we can see around us. Say for instance, the oxygen that we breathe, we write that as O2. In nature, that is diatomic. Lagi siyang dalwahan. So it comes in pairs. Hindi siya nag-iisa. Another example would be the hemoglobin, which is found in our red blood cells that functions to transport this oxygen throughout the body. So this hemoglobin is actually consists of thousands of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur atoms which are joined together. So most of this matter around us, if not all, are actually aggregates of different atoms. So ano ba ang nasa likod ng pagsasama-sama ng iba't ibang klase ng atoms na to? That's actually explained by what we call chemical bond. Okay, so we will have that with this first section. Let's define what chemical bond is. So chemical bond refer to a force that holds group of two or more atoms together and makes them function as a unit. So ito pala yung force na nagbabind. So pwedeng dalawa o mas marami pa na atoms such that after this bonding, it no longer acts, itong mga elements na to, they no longer, or atoms, they no longer act on their own, but rather, they already function as one unit. Let's take, for example, water. We write the chemical formula for water as H2O, meaning it consists of two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen. Initially, ganyan siya, no? But because of this force of this chemical bond, it actually holds these two hydrogen atoms together with the oxygen. So after this chemical bonding, pag nabuo na itong ating water, yung properties niya is already different from hydrogen alone or with oxygen alone. It forms a new unit which functions on its own. Okay? Another definition for chemical bond would be the physical phenomena of chemical substances being held together by the attraction of atoms to each other through either sharing or exchanging of electrons or electrostatic force. So later, as we go along the discussion, we'll be able to find out further ano bang ibig sabihin itong sharing or exchanging of electrons. So we were able to define already what a chemical bond is. But that leads us to another question. What causes this force or this bond? Okay, now these bonds are formed when constituent atoms come close enough together such that the outer electrons of one atom are attracted to the positive nuclear charge of its neighbor. Sa nakaraang neighbor atom, neighboring atom. So sa nakaraang definition natin, nabanggit yung electrostatic force. At dun sa mga nakaraang discussion natin, videos, lagi nababanggit yung electrostatic rule, which basically states na pag meron kang dalawang charged bodies or particles, kapag magkaiba yung charge nila, one positive, one negative, it causes them to get attracted to one another. So meron kang outer electrons. Take note tayo nasa outer na shell lang or energy level. Itong mga outer electrons na to na merong negative charge, kapag napapalapit yung atom sa isa pang atom, they get attracted to the positive nucleus of that particular neighboring atom. So na-attract siya to. That causes the force or the bond. So in this picture on the side, we have an electron on the outermost shell, na-attract siya dun sa positive charge ng nucleus na nagtataglay ng proton noong katabi na atom. Okay? So nasagot na natin. Ano nagko-cause ng force? It's the attraction between these charged particles. Pero that actually leads us to another question. Kailangan ba talaga na mag-form ng bonds? Kasi kanina sir, nabanggit nyo, most of this matter around us ay aggregate, pinagsama-sama na ng mga atoms ng iba't ibang elements. Very rare na nag-iisa. Kailangan ba talaga na mag-form sila ng bond? Actually, kailangan. Atoms interact with one another to form aggregates such as molecules, compounds, and crystals because doing so lowers the total energy of the system. Ano naman kung ma-lower yung energy, total energy of the system? Lowering the energy results to this aggregate being more stable than the isolated atom. So, mas stable yung state nila kapag magkakasama kaysa kung magkakahiwalay. Anong ibig sabihin ng pagiging stable na yun, sir? So, many atoms become stable when their outermost shell is filled with electrons or when they satisfy what we call octet rule by having 8 electrons in their outermost shell. So, tanda pa ba yung model ni Bohr? So, para mas madali natin ma-visualize, di ba, meron tayong mga shells or mga energy levels. So, naging stable daw ang isang atom kapag yung outermost shell na ay filled with electrons. Tanda pa yung mga shells or energy levels na yan, may specific na bilang ng mga electrons na dapat na nandun. So, kapag filled yung shell na yon, na kung ilan yung electrons na dapat na nandun, mas nagiging stable siya. Or in most of the elements, they follow the octet rule. So, di ba, parang octagon, tas 8 sides. Dito, ang binabanggit naman, stable ang mga atoms kapag meron siyang 8 electrons sa kanyang outermost shell. So, ganun ina-achieve yun, may mga elements dalawa lang. Halimbawa, yung mga hydrogen na yan. Di ba, 1s2, yun yung una sa ating electron config. So, basta ma-fill lang yung 2 na yon, stable na sila. O sa iba nga, 8, or may mga elements na iba pang bilang. Hanggat hindi na-achieve yun, hindi sila magiging stable. So, kumbaga, ang target nila, hanggang hindi sila naging stable, ay mag-form ng chemical bonds sa iba't ibang mga atoms. Okay? Another reason why there is a need for chemical bonds is that this bonding and the structure actually play a central role in determining the course of chemical reactions and properties nitong mga iba't ibang matter na ito, many of which are vital to our survival. Take for instance, these two substances we have on the screen. You have the diamond and graphite. Okay, what about this diamond and graphite? Both graphite and diamond are composed solely of carbon atoms. So, carbon lang ang taglay-taglay nitong dalawang to. However, graphite is soft, slippery material used in pencils, whereas diamond is one of the hardest materials known, valuable both as gemstone and in industrial cutting tools. So, despite the fact na pareho sila na carbon lang ang laman, pero magkaiba yung kanilang properties because of the chemical bond and the structure of the atoms inside of these two. Okay? So, nasagot na natin yung unang tanong, what is a chemical bond? Meron pa tayong mga bonus. Nasagot natin what causes this bond or this force, and why is there a need to form a chemical bond. We will now proceed to the next question. Next question, which is, what are the different types of chemical bond and how are each type formed? So, ito naman yung pag-usapan natin. Okay, the type of bonding is determined by how the outermost electrons of an atom, the so-called valence electrons, interact with neighboring atoms. Kanina nabanggit natin, di ba? Itong mga neighboring atoms na to, these outermost electrons, they get attracted to the nucleus of the neighboring atoms. So ang tawag pala sa mga electrons in the outermost shell ay valence electrons. Valence electrons kasi yung outermost shell na yan, ang tawag naman ay valence shell. So, balikan natin, outermost shell, pinakamalayo sa nucleus na energy level or shell, that is what we call valence shell. Yung mga electrons na nandun sa valence shell, ang tawag ay valence electrons. So, itong mga electrons na to, ito lang yung na-attract, nag-i-interact sa iba pang mga atoms. Let's take for instance iron. So, kung gagawa din ito ng electron configuration, gaya ng nakaraang video, so we've got to determine first the atomic number. So, the atomic number of iron is 26, meaning to say, it also has 26 electrons. So, yun yung iaayos natin sa ating electron configuration. So, here, at the lower part, you have the electron configuration for iron. So, 1s2, 2s2, 2p6, 3s2, 3p6, 4s2, 3d6. So, tama naman. Si Sisa pumasok sa pinto, si Daddy. Tama yung pagkakasunod-sunod. If we're gonna add up all this superscript, 2 plus 2, 4, plus 6, 10, 12, 18, 20, 26. So, alin yung tinutukoy ito na valence electrons? Yung mga electrons sa outermost shell or valence shell. Alin ba dito yung outermost shell? Or pinakamalayo, pinakamataas na energy level? So, di ba ito yung mga number, ito yung mga energy levels or shells. 1, 2, 3, at pinakamataas ay 4. So, ito yung 4, yun yung valence shell niya. Ilan yung electrons na nandun na meron ang iron? Ayun, 2. Kaya makita nyo sa picture, meron tayong 2 electrons dun sa kanyang outermost shell. Yun yung tinutukoy na valence electron. So, sabi dito sa una, yung the type of bonding nakadepende kung paano ba itong mga valence electrons ay makikipag-interact sa kanyang mga neighboring atoms. Okay? Another factor in determining the type of bond would be the position of the elements involved in the periodic table. Bakit mahalaga yung position? Ano ba yung binabanggit nun regarding the element or the atom? So, when you were in grade 7, you have learned about the periodic table of elements. Natutunan natin dito yung iba't ibang klase rin ng element. So, alam natin, we have here these elements na nagfo-form ng parang hagdan or ladder. These are what we refer to as the metalloids. Tama? Or the semi-metals. Mahalaga ito because ito yung nagiging tanda natin. Alam natin lahat ng mga elements to the left of this ladder of the metalloids except for hydrogen, these are all metals. And then the ones to the right of this ladder, this time are the non-metals. Kasama, of course, si hydrogen. So, position daw ng mga elements in the periodic table tells the type of bond kasi yung position na yun tells us kung anong klase ng elements yung involved sa bonding na yan. So, mahalaga rin yun. By the way, bago tayo mag-proceed, isa pa na maaari nating makuha dito sa periodic table would be this. Di ba? May mga groupings tayo ng mga elements dito. Yung groups, yun yung vertical arrangement ng atom. Group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4, group 5, group 6, 7, 8. So, very helpful din ito kasi itong mga grupo na to, binabanggit din ito kung ilan yung valence electron, yung electron na nasa outermost shell ng mga elements natin. Lahat ng nasa group 1 na to, meron siyang isa na valence electron. Nasa group 2, 2, nasa group 3, 3, group 4, 4, group 5, 5, group 6, 6, group 7, ay di 7. Group 8, 8 na electrons. Kaya itong mga to, these are the noble gases. These are stable elements. Kasi nasunod na nila yung octet. So, stable na sila. Non-reactive itong mga elements na ito. Okay? So, anyway, let's proceed. So, these are the two types of chemical bond. We have the ionic bond and covalent bond. Pag-ibahin muna natin siya kung paano ba nag-i-interact yung mga valence electrons sa neighboring atoms niya. For ionic bond, this is the result of the transfer of electrons of the valence electrons from one element to another. So, nagkakaroon pala nito, na-form ito kapag nagkakaroon ng transfer ng electrons from one atom to another. Whereas kapag naman covalent bond, this is the result of sharing. Walang nagaganap na transfer, nagsishare lang yung dalawang atoms na involved. Okay? Ionic bond, transfer, covalent, sharing. Ano pa ang pinagkaiba nitong dalawang to? If we're going to base that on the elements involved, ito yung pinagkaiba. Kapag ang involved ay isang metal, isang non-metal, then that forms an ionic bond. Isang nasa left, isang nasa right. Kapag naman covalent bond, ang involved dito ay dalawang non-metal. Parehas na nasa right side. Or pwede na isang metalloid at isang non-metal. So these are the two types of chemical bond, and ito yung pagkakaiba nila. For ionic, transfer, metal, non-metal. Kapag covalent naman, sharing of electrons, two metals or one metalloid and one non-metal. So let's discuss further itong mga types of chemical bond na to. Paano ba sila na-form? Starting off with ionic bond. So again, as we have mentioned, ionic bond is a chemical bond formed through the transfer of one or more electrons from one atom or group of atoms to another atom or group of atoms. So it involves the transfer of one or more electrons. So paano ba nangyayari yun? Let's take for instance, sodium and chlorine. Okay, so when sodium and chlorine react to form sodium chloride, this is our table salt, electrons are transferred from the sodium atom to the chlorine atom to form your sodium and chlorine ions. By the way, when we speak of ions, these are charged atoms. Kasi by nature, itong mga atoms natin, they are neutral, di ba? Kasi same number of protons and electrons. But because of the transfer of electrons, may isa na nag-lose, may isa na nag-gain, nagpo-form ka ng ions or charged atoms, which then aggregate to form the solid sodium chloride. Okay, so balikan natin to, no? So, si sodium, nasan siya? Andito siya sa periodic table. Si chlorine, nandun siya. So, ito yung ating palatandaan. You have one metal, you have one non-metal. Definitely, ionic bond. So, paano naman nangyari yung transfer? So, di ba, may pinapakita sa atin itong periodic table. Yung kanyang grouping tells us the information regarding the number of valence electron. Si sodium, ilan yung kanyang valence electron? Group 1, ay di isa. Si chlorine naman, nasa group 7, so meron siyang 7. So ito, tama, may isang electron sa outermost shell, meron siyang isang valence electron. Si chlorine naman, meron siyang 7. So, alin nga ang goal nila? Ang goal ng mga atoms ay maging stable. Paano sila maging stable? Either ma-occupy, ma-fill yung number of electrons sa kanyang outermost shell, o kaya naman ay maabot niya yung tinatawag na octet rule, na dapat siya ay makawalo na electron sa outermost shell. Tingnan natin sila. Si sodium, meron siyang isa. Ang electron config nito ay 1s2, 2s2, 2p6, 3s1. Kasi yung sodium has an atomic number of 11. So, meron siyang 11 na electrons. So, tama naman, 4 plus 6, 10 plus 1, 11. Okay? Outermost shell niya ay third, tas meron siyang isa doon. Si chlorine naman, dahil nandito siya sa ating 7th na group, meron siyang 7 na nasa labas. So, si chlorine, ilan na lang kulang niya? Isa na lang, di ba? Para maging 8. Si sodium naman, para maging 8 to, kailangan pa niya ng 7. So, alin ang mas madali na gawin ni sodium? Mas madali ba na ibigay na lang niya itong electron na isa? O kumuha siya ng 7? Pag binigay niya itong isang electron na to, ang magiging number of electrons lang niya ay 10. At ang magiging outermost shell would be yung second energy level, 2. Ito, 2 plus 6, magkakaroon na siya ng octet. So, magiging stable na siya. Si sodium, mas madali sa kanya na ibigay itong electron na to. Kaya, what's going to happen is that sodium will transfer this electron to chlorine. So, si chlorine, madadagan ng isa, magiging 8 na yan. Okay? So, in this way, pareho na silang stable. Now, since si sodium ay nawalan ng isang electron na negatively charged, naging siyang more positive. Naging siyang positively charged. Si chlorine naman, since tumanggap siya ng isang electron, nadagdagan yung charges niya with negative charge, it became negatively charge. So following the electrostatic rule, you have a positively charged particle, negatively charged particle. These two atoms will get attracted to one another, and that will form the ionic bond, forming your solid sodium chloride, yung asin, table salt na ating ginagamit. Okay? So again, ionic bond, it involves the transfer of electrons. Nakita natin yung pagka-transfer, para mag-gain yung stability. And it involves metal and non-metal. Okay? Another way of visualizing this would be through a Lewis diagram. So dito sa Lewis diagram, ginagamit yung chemical symbol ng ating mga elements, sodium, di ba, Na, chlorine, Cl, and it makes use of dots. So yung mga dots na yan around the chemical symbol would be the number of valence electrons. Diba? Si sodium, 1, si chlorine, 7. So after this, nag-lose itong si sodium ng isa, napapunta na kay chlorine. So 8 na siya. Ito naman ay stable na rin siya. Kasi 8 na rin yung natira dun sa kanyang outermost shell. This became positively charged, this became negatively charged. That resulted to the formation of an ionic bond, forming yung ating sodium chloride. Okay? Another example would be magnesium. Nasaan si magnesium? Group 2. So meron siyang 2 valence electron. Si oxygen, ayun, nasa group 6. So meron siyang 6 na electrons. So 6, 2. So si magnesium, again, tulad ni sodium, mas madali sa kanya na ibigay na lang itong 2 electron kaysa kumuha siya ng 6 na electrons, marami-rami pa yon. So what happens is that these 2 electrons will again be transferred to oxygen. So dahil nag-lose itong si magnesium ng 2 negatively charged particle, it became more positively charged. Si oxygen nag-gain ng 2 electron na negatively charged particle, so mas naging negative itong charge nitong oxygen. Because we have one positively charged particle, another negatively charged, it caused these two to become attracted to one another, again forming the ionic bond and your magnesium oxide. Okay? So, dun siya na-form. That's another example of ionic bond. So, several common examples of ionic compounds would be this list. Okay? So, nangunguna yung ating sodium chloride, yung ating table salt. At iba pang mga examples that you can as well read that's included in your module. Okay? So, this time we will proceed with the second type. Okay? With the covalent bond. Paano ba nangyayari yung covalent bond na yon? So, again, as we mentioned a while ago, a covalent bond is a chemical bond formed through this time sharing of one or more pairs of electron between two atoms. Kung kay ionic, merong involved na transfer of electrons. Kapag covalent naman, nag-share lang ng electrons. Let's take for instance the water that we've given a while ago. Okay, so when hydrogen atoms are close together, the two electrons are simultaneously attracted to both nuclei. So the electron probability increases between the two nuclei, indicating that the electrons are shared by the two nuclei. So, ang ating hydrogen, di ba, nasa group 1 din. So, ibig sabihin, meron siyang isang electron lang. Yun lang naman ang nag-iisang electron niya, di ba? Kaya, ang kanyang electron configuration is 1s1. So, kulang siya ng isa para ma-fill in yung energy level or shell na ito. Ngayon, meron siyang nakatabi na isa pa na hydrogen. Kulang din ng isa. Hindi nila pwedeng ibigay yung tig-isa nila. Otherwise, mawawala naman siya ng electron. Hindi pwede yun. So, what happens here is that instead na magbigayan, they share their electron. So, sinare niyo yung kanyang electron sa isa, sinare ng isa yung kanyang electron, pareho sila nagkaroon na ng 2 electrons. Okay? So, that is how, and this bond, the sharing, results to a covalent bond. That's when you form your water. Okay? So, yun yung pinagkaiba niya. Kapag ionic, may transfer. Kapag covalent, it is simply sharing. So, balik ulit tayo sa Lewis diagram. Meron tayong mga dots ulit representing the valence electron. So, you have 1 electron for hydrogen. You have another electron for another hydrogen atom. So, they share nila yung tig-isa nilang electron, forming your hydrogen na molecule. Kasi usually itong hydrogen, it also comes in pair. Same with oxygen. Yung kanina pala ay hindi water, hydrogen lang pala itong ating example dito. Okay? Another would be for chlorine. So, you have here si chlorine, nasan siya? Diba, nandito. So, dito, pareho naman na hydrogen, so non-metal. Chlorine, ito, dalawang chlorine din, so nasa group number 7. So, 7, kulang siya ng isa. Meron siyang nakatabi na isa pa na chlorine atom na kulang din ng isa. So, mangyayari, pwede nilang i-share yung tig-isa nilang electrons para pag binilang natin, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, plus yung isa electron ng isa, 8. Itong isa, 8 na rin. So, pareho na silang stable. And that forms your Cl2. Itong mga nandito sa grupo na ito, the halogens, these are also diatomic in nature. Lagi silang they come in pair para stable. Okay? So that's basically how covalent bonds are formed, sharing. Okay? Now, this covalent bond actually has two types. Okay? You have the first polar covalent and the other one non-polar covalent. So, how are these two different? For polar covalent, the electrons are unequally shared by the atoms and spend more time close to one atom than the other. This usually happens when it involves two different atoms. Say for instance, in an example, you have hydrogen and chlorine. So chlorine has 7 valence electrons, and you have your hydrogen which only has 1. So syempre, yung mga electrons are more condensed, they are more on the chlorine side. So that results to a partially negative side, and on the hydrogens, dito naman sa side ng hydrogen, since kakaunti yung electron dito na negatively charged, that results to a partially positive na side. So, unequal yung sharing ng electrons. Kapag non-polar covalent naman, forms between two atoms of the same element, or pwedeng atoms of different elements that share electrons more or less equally. So, in this case, kapag halos pantay yung distribution ng ating electrons dun sa compound na na-form, so that results to a non-polar covalent bond. Sa chlorine, magkapareho naman silang bilang electrons, so pantay lang. So that's a non-polar covalent bond. So polar covalent, an equal sharing of the electrons. Non-polar covalent, more or less equally shared electrons. Okay? Now, for the common covalent compounds, we have examples are you have your water, the oxygen that we breathe, and examples would be the different types of alcohol. These are actually examples of covalent compounds. We are now on the third part, the difference between covalent and ionic compounds. So basically, yung mga compounds na merong covalent bond, these are what we refer to as covalent compounds. Yung mga compounds naman na merong ionic bond, yun yung mga ionic compounds. Paano ba nagkakaiba itong mga compounds na to? So we're going to compare few properties. Itong mga to, we're gonna compare them all together. Hindi pwedeng isa lang. Okay? Kailangan i-compare natin itong set of properties na to. Starting off with what we call conductivity. So conductivity is actually the measure of the ease at which an electric charge or heat pass through a material. So dito, gaano ba kadali na mag-flow ang electricity or heat sa material na to. That's what we call conductivity. So for ionic compounds, it has low conductivity. So hindi siya masyadong nag-a-allow ng flow ng electricity at ng heat. Ang covalent naman, very low conductivity. So kung hindi nag-a-allow ang ionic, mas hindi pa nag-a-allow ng flow ng electric charge or heat itong mga covalent compound. Okay? Next, we have what we call hardness. This is the resistance of a material to deformation. Kakayahan niya na mag-resist, na ma-deform of an indenter of specific size and shape under known load. So for ionic, it is hard because of its crystalline structure. Di ba yung mga salt, yung mga chunk ng mga anong yan? Covalent naman, not very hard, though there are exceptions like silicon, diamond, and carbon. Okay? So, kaya sabi natin, you take a look at this set of properties. Hindi pwedeng hardness lang. Hindi pwedeng conductivity. Kailangan tingnan mo sila, itong set of properties na to para ma-differentiate mo. So, for hardness, ionic, hard. Covalent, not very hard, but meron tayong exception. Melting point. The temperature at which a material changes from solid to liquid. Temperature kung saan ang isang bagay ay nag-melt. To turn into solid to liquid. And then we have boiling point. Temperature at which a material changes from liquid to gas. So ito yung temperature naman kung kailan nagbo-boil ang isang bagay, nag-change from liquid turning into gas. Anong pinagkaiba ng ionic and covalent compound in terms of melting and boiling point? For ionic compound, they have high melting point and high boiling point. So, hindi sila madaling mag-melt, hindi madaling mag-boil. Kapag covalent naman, it has low melting point and low boiling point. Ang covalent compound naman, madaling mag-melt, madaling matunaw, madaling kumulo, kumbaga. Okay? Ionic, di ba? Dito yung table salt. Di ba? Minsan sa asin, nagluluto ang ating nanay o tatay. Naluto na, kumulo na, pero nalalasahan mo pa rin yung mga buo-buo na asin. Kasi mahirap nga ito na ma-melt. It requires very high temperature. Okay? So next, anyway, we actually have a table pala dito. For ionic compound, nakita nyo yung kanyang melting at boiling point, napakataas. Napakataas kasi mataas yung energy na kailangan para ma-break yung strong ionic bond between the atoms na bumubuo dun sa compound na yun. For covalent compounds naman, nakita nyo, napakababa, nagne-negative pa. Mas mababa pa sa zero. Ano yung kanyang melting at boiling point? Mababa naman yung melting at boiling point ng covalent compound kasi mababa yung energy na kailangan para ma-overcome yung weak na covalent bond between the atoms. Okay? Kaya madali siyang mag-boil at mag-melt. Okay? Let's proceed with the next properties. We have volatility, tendency of a substance to evaporate at a normal temperature. So, yung tendency ng mga material na mabilis na mag-vaporize, mag-evaporate kahit nasa normal na temperature naman. So, ano pinagkaiba ng ionic at covalent? Ang ionic, low volatility. So, hindi siya volatile, hindi siya madaling mag-vaporize. Covalent naman, highly volatile, madali siyang mag-vaporize. Example ng covalent compound, yung petroleum. It has covalent bonds. Di ba pag nasa gasolinahan, naaamoy mo yung gasolina. Kasi pag sasalin ng gasolina, mabilis yan na nag-turn into vapors and diffuse sa ating air, kaya naaamoy ng mga nagpapagasolina na nandun. Okay? And lastly, we have what we call solubility, ability for a given substance, the solute, to dissolve in a solvent. Kakayahan ng isang material, ability ng isang material na ma-dissolve sa isa pang substance. Okay? So for ionic compounds, they usually dissolve in water, but is insoluble in organic solvents such as alcohol, benzene, propane, and other organic solvents. Okay? Covalent naman, usually insoluble. So pag ionic, usually natutunaw sa tubig, pero hindi sa mga alcohol, benzene, etc. Pag covalent, usually insoluble in water, hindi natutunaw sa tubig, but soluble in organic solvents such as alcohol, benzene, and propane. So for you to be able to differentiate these two types of compound, if you simply want to look at it, so you've got to compare this set of properties, itong mga pinag-usapan natin. Okay? Now, let's find out if you were able to understand what we have discussed in this video. Let's have practice exercise number 1. Okay? So, let's read the problem first. Sample A has a boiling point of 1049 degrees Celsius, whereas sample B boils at 78 degrees Celsius. In addition, sample A is soluble in water, whereas sample B is soluble in organic solvents. Which between the two is an ionic compound? Okay, so in this problem, we will have to take into consideration the different properties that we have discussed a while ago. So palagay nyo, yung sample A, ang taas ng boiling point. Sample B, mababa. Sample A, soluble in water. Sample B, soluble in organic solvents such as alcohol, benzene, and the likes. So ano kaya dito ang ionic compound? So examining these properties, it tells us that the ionic compound here is probably sample A because of its high boiling point and its solubility with water. Okay, hopefully nakuha yun. Let's have this time practice exercise number 2, problem number 2. So let's read this first. Methane melts at negative 182 degrees Celsius, whereas sodium fluoride melts at 993 degrees Celsius. Both are poor conductors of electricity and heat. However, methane is highly volatile, so madali siyang mag-vaporize, mag-evaporate, while sodium fluoride has low volatility, so hindi siya madali mag-vaporize. Which between the two is a covalent compound. Alin kaya dito? Sige, bigyan ko kayo ng time. You examine the properties of these two samples that we have here based on what we have discussed and then decide alin sa kanila ang covalent compound. Alin na nagtataglay ng covalent bond. Okay? Na compare nyo na ba? Definitely for this problem, the covalent compound would be the methane because of its high volatility. Sabi dito, it has high volatility, it vaporizes easily, and because of its low melting point. Anyway, pareho naman sila na poor conductor of electricity and heat. Ionic compound or covalent compound, parehong poor conductor of electricity and heat. Let's have the third one. Is phosphorus trichloride an ionic compound or a covalent compound? Ano kaya ito? So ano yung walang nakalagay ng mga properties? Ano yung pwede nating pagbasihan dito para malaman? Looking at the compound here given. So pwede nating tingnan kung ito bang involved ay metal, non-metal, parehong non-metal, isang metalloid at isang non-metal. So I want you to take a look at your periodic table of elements or pwede kayo mag-search, mag-open ng tab, tingnan kung anong klase ng element itong mga nandito sa compound na ito. Okay? Nakita nyo na? So, phosphorus, this is a non-metal. Chlorine is another non-metal. So, if the two atoms involved are both non-metal, then definitely this is a covalent compound. Okay? So, kapag dalawang non-metal o kaya isang non-metal, isang metalloid, covalent. Kapag isang metal, isang non-metal, so magkaiba silang klase, isang nasa left side ng periodic table, isang nasa right side, ionic compound naman yan. Okay? So anyway, kung may mga hindi pa nakuha, nahirapan, you can go back to the previous parts of the video. Pwedeng panoorin ulit para mas maintindihan. So this ends our video for this week. Hopefully you have learned something. If there are questions, you can type that down in the comment section below. So maraming salamat and see you on the next video. Bye. Kung bago ka pa lang sa channel na ito, make sure na mag-subscribe at i-click ang notification bell para updated ka sa bawat upload namin.